I'm going to say hello to everybody so you can actually see me up here and know that I'm an actual real person.
Thank you, sir.
Which is always useful to know. And then I'll turn it off because it's probably very distracting to see me up here and see the slides. So you'll see the slides a little bit bigger when I sign off here. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I'm very excited about this opportunity to chat with you all, and I have a large number of slides that I want to share. I've got a lot of information I want to share. I'm really glad it's being recorded because I'm going to talk a little fast, but I want to make sure that you get a good deal of content. As Mike described, none of the handouts are necessary for the meeting today, but they're all resources that you might be able to use, including PDFs of the slides, a worksheet that goes along with it, an Excel spreadsheet, and then a document that shares some of the national data that will be useful. As I move forward, one of the things that I want to make sure that everybody knows is that even though I'm the one presenting this webinar, there are plenty of people who have contributed to this work and have done a lot of really, really good, dedicated work in this area. So here are the names of those people up on the screen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk really, really briefly about disproportionality and move right into intervention work, and then spend most of the time talking about using our data for assessing and addressing disproportionality, particularly discipline disproportionality. So many of you are aware, especially if you're tuning in here, that disproportionality in school discipline by race, ethnicity, and disability is a big challenge. These are our most recent national data from the Office of Civil Rights. And you can see it's a couple years old. We're still waiting on the data from a couple years to get fully released. But what you've got here is the percent of students suspended out of school in a given year. And you've got a dark bar, which is percent of elementary students, and a little bit of a lighter bar, which is percent of secondary students. So if you look at that piece all the way on the left, what you'll see is all students. So what that says is 2.6% of elementary school students were suspended out of school at least once during the school year. In secondary, it's 10.1%. And then you can start looking as it's disaggregated across, and you can see that there are some predictable differences and some parts that are a little bit interesting here. What people often do when you look at these percent of students receiving suspension, which is also called a risk index that I'll describe in just a little bit, is compare it to a comparison group so you can see whether there's over referral or under referral for any of these groups. So what I'm going to do is I'll just draw a little line across here. This is the elementary line for white students, and then here is the secondary line for white students. So if it's below the line, that means that there is a reduced risk for out-of-school suspension. If it's above the line, that means there's increased compared to white students, or generally the majority of students in the country, although not necessarily in California. But what you see here pretty clearly is that for Black or African American students, the rates are quite a bit higher than any other group right there. 7.6% of students in elementary school were suspended out of school, which is actually higher than the percent of secondary students for white students. The number 2 group, interestingly enough, is disabilities. And if you think about intersectionality and compounded risk, the percent of students who are Black with disabilities, particularly in secondary school, who are sent out of school is very, very large. During this year, 1 out of every 5 schools in the country, 1 out of every 5 districts in the country suspended more than half of their Black male students with disabilities in secondary school. So that's 1 in 5 districts suspended more than half of their students. So that leads us to this question. Most of you, if you're sitting here, are pretty familiar with the challenge and are interested in knowing what to do about it. But the challenge is, for many of us who have tried this, we run into a lot of difficulty about being able to address this in a way that works in schools. So I ask, like, how often are we successful in doing this? And that's led us to a lot of the work that we've been doing. I like to use this road sign, a picture in Vietnam, to describe what this idea is for those of us who are working in this area. As you can see, go left is to the flower garden, and go right is to the nuclear reactor. And the challenge is, if we see something that looks uncomfortable to us, if we see something that looks dangerous, it is definitely our common reaction to avoid that uncomfortable conversation, to avoid that and shoot right over to the flower garden instead. But we've really got to go to that nuclear reactor if we're going to make a difference in terms of student outcomes. And what we've been trying to do is to have this understanding of what makes it so uncomfortable for us to talk about issues of race and ethnicity and equity in schools, and what can we do about it. So one of the things that we do is we start with 4 key assumptions. Number 1, if you are here, if you are paying attention to the news, if you've been paying attention to presidential debates, then you know the extent of disproportionality out there. The other thing is that there are a lot of people, particularly people on this webinar and watching this video, who are really committed to making a change in terms of school discipline. The third part is acknowledging for people that the work that we're talking about doing is inherently uncomfortable and very, very difficult to do. This is not easy work, and when I do this work with school districts, when I do this work in schools, that's where we've been testing out this approach, we tell people to get comfortable with discomfort, that it is normal and it's not something to hide from. And then the fourth assumption is that there are lots of different things that we could do to try to enhance equity in schools. And one of the key things is, I think a lot of times people get into these conversations that are really, really uncomfortable, but they don't actually move toward what are the things that we're going to do differently to enhance equity in schools. And so from us at the PBIS Center, one of the key things that we've been doing is working on what are the things to do with these assumptions in mind. So you might be familiar with the saying that for every complex problem there is a simple solution that won't work. We know that very, very well. And what we've put together from the center is a number of free resources for what we think are the 5 most helpful things to do, the 5 most effective parts of a strategy to enhance equity in schools. And know, as I described some of these, and you can see down here at the bottom, that's our equity webpage on the PBIS.org site. That's where all of our materials, presentations, resources are available for you, including some of the guides that I'm going to describe here. So recognize that there might be some things in these 5 points when you're thinking about, like, what are the things that we think are really moving the needle in terms of equity, and they might not be reflected in this list right here. And that's all right. What I would say that's most important is don't stop doing things that you believe are working. We don't have enough research in showing that absolutely without a doubt this does not work and absolutely without a doubt this does work. We know a few things. We know that zero tolerance doesn't work particularly well. And I'm going to talk through some of the things that actually might work pretty well. But we don't know enough to say, oh yeah, you know, this particular approach that you're trying out and seems to be working in your schools, you should stop doing and do these things instead. But these are what we view as our 5 best bets for this. I should note too, please do feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I'll take a look in there from time to time. So if you've got a burning question, by all means ask away. If you don't, then just hold on and I'll keep talking. So here are our 5 points. Number 1 is use disaggregated discipline data so that we can actually measure the extent of disproportionality by race, ethnicity, disability as well. And make sure that what we're doing is actually working for each student, not just most students. Number 2, we want to put a behavior framework that's multi-tiered, that's preventive, that has an instructional approach, and is flexible enough to be adapted to the needs of your students, their families, community members, and also staff. Number 3, use engaging academic instruction to reduce what some people call the achievement gap and what we've been more often calling the opportunity gap because of gaps in opportunity for good instruction. Number 4, develop policies with accountability for disciplinary equity. And then number 5, provide specific strategies in interacting with students to neutralize the effects of implicit bias on our decision making. So as I described before, we're going to spend most of the time, I'm actually going to walk you through this disproportionality data guide, which you can find at the website below, and give you a sense of how this fits. By starting with data, we can know the extent of the problem, and we can start pointing out what are the other 4 things that are going to be most useful for us. So stay tuned. I'm going to move through a couple of the other ones real quickly and come right back to data. So number 2, that's the behavior framework that's preventive, instructional, multi-tiered, and culturally responsive. So for many of you who are paying attention here, you are going to be thinking, oh yeah, we use our PBIS systems for that. And here's some ideas on how PBIS might be effective in enhancing equity in school discipline. Well, number 1, when we don't assume that students know exactly what we're expecting them to do, and we actually teach them, we're going to prevent some challenges of unwanted behavior that just arise from miscommunication as opposed to willful disobedience or something like that. Number 2, if we've got tools for enhancing student-teacher interactions, if we've got systems that help increase the opportunities at a time where we have conversations with students about their positive behavior instead of just correcting their behavior, we can enhance relationships. The idea behind this is to be able to put money in our relationship bank account. What we don't want to do is run into a situation where we've got to make a withdrawal on that bank account and there are insufficient funds in that account. And so by being positive with students, by recognizing when they're doing things right, by recognizing their attempts towards success, we're going to build that up in case we need to do some correction. Another piece here is ensuring that our referral and discipline procedures are more objective rather than subjective. The research out there in bias, and particularly implicit bias, says the more ambiguous the decision, the more likely there is going to be the chance of those biases affecting the decisions that we make. So ambiguity, especially in our discipline systems, is disproportionality's best friend, more likely to cause challenges for us. If we're more objective, if it's really, really clear to the staff and to the students what are the things that, that we don't want to see, how are we supposed to handle that, that works way better. And then also, if we provide for our staff tools other than just sending students out of the classroom, then we're going to be able to keep more students in instruction, and we're going to be able to teach them the skills that they need instead of assuming that punishing them and excluding them from the classroom teaches them how to do things right. So the good thing is we do have some research on that PBIS does affect discipline disproportionality. Here's a large-scale evaluation looking at the black-white office referral disproportionality in schools implementing PBIS versus schools not implementing PBIS. There's statistically significantly lower disproportionality in those schools that were implementing well versus not. When schools are implementing, decreases are seen across racial ethnic groups overall, as opposed to just for white students or just for some students. In some cases, there's a case study showing larger decreases for students of color than for white students, and that it's effective in reducing exclusionary discipline in indigenous-run schools as well. But one of the things that's really interesting is we want to be really careful of the idea of saying just because we're implementing PBIS, then we are not going to see challenges with disciplinary equity. And the challenge is there's a few ways to implement PBIS, and one way is to sort of say, hey, you know, this looks like a good set of expectations, and let's go online and let's find a matrix from some other school that has the same mascot as we do, and then we'll just find and replace the title, and then we'll assume that it works. And one of the things that's really important is that PBIS is best when it is adapted and tailored to the specific needs of the school, to the culture of students and families. So I'm going to describe some of the, a couple strategies that come from a cultural responsiveness field guide that's going to be coming out a little bit later this fall, and you'll find it on the equity page. So most of you are familiar with building those school-wide expectations matrices out there. And they're very, very useful. We're clear about what we want for students. Among staff, we know what we're expecting. We're trying to cut down on any miscommunication we have. We're trying to make the implicit explicit so that we don't make assumptions about students' knowledge. And we want to focus on what to do as opposed to what not to do. So I was describing before this idea of going online and grabbing somebody else's matrix and making changes and assuming that that would work. What I'm going to show you is a matrix from a school that originally did something like that and then said, you know what, we need to revise our matrix to make it work better for the students who we have and better for their needs. So here's a matrix. This is a school. This is an inner city school in Virginia. What they did is they took, if you can see here, their expectations, they changed them to swag. So they took this, if anybody's familiar with swag or swagger, they took this idea of being kind of like prideful or boastful about your behavior and turned it around, reversed it, so that students could have swag, so students could show off by following the expectations. And so what you see is the expectations: safety first, work together respectfully, accept responsibility. And then that fourth one is really interesting. The fourth one is guide me. And those aren't adults' expectations of students. Those are actually what students can expect from the adults in the building to support them, which is kind of cool. I'm also going to share with you another activity that you might use in your schools, and it's something called a personal matrix. Sometimes this might be called a behavior dictionary. What I'm going to do is I'll just talk you through it so you can see what it looks like in real life and then get a little bit of a sense of it. So here's an example of what that would look like. If you've got your expectations in a column here, you've got a column that says at school it looks like, a column that says at home it looks like, and in my neighborhood it looks like. So that in school it looks like, that's actually for the school staff to complete. That might be if you've got a column in your matrix that says all settings all the time or school-wide. Those might be what you'd have there. Then when you give this to students, you leave the home and neighborhood columns blank, and you ask students to complete those. So we want to be careful not to make assumptions about what students' home life looks for them based on the color of their skin or other characteristics about them, or what kind of neighborhood they live in. But we also want to have a sense of how different that might be from school. So here's a little sample completed form here. And what you can do is you can look here. Number one, it helps students understand that these expectations for students, or the values that we have, can actually reach beyond the school walls, which I think is really useful in saying, like, hey, yeah, this is like our social emotional curriculum. Like, these are the anchors for our teaching students about how to get along with each other. But what you can see here is there may be times when these other columns look very similar, and there may be times when they look really, really different. And so what you can do is you can look at those differences and ask yourself, are those different school rules necessary for positive student development? And it may very well be that they're not, that they're just random, that they're just sort of, oh, well, this is how schools are supposed to be. And so if you see some of those commonalities there, you can just change those rules so that they line up more with students' homes and neighborhoods, and that they've got to make less of a leap of their culture to go to school than they otherwise would. But there are also going to be times where we say, you know what, because students' home expectations and neighborhood expectations are really diverse and are really different, and there might be ones where we say, we just can't do that with 800 kids in our school. If that's the case, then we want to acknowledge that explicitly and provide additional teaching and practice and acknowledgement, and expect students to make behavior errors or mistakes because they've been following expectations that are different for a good chunk of the day. So that's just a little bit of a taste of cultural responsiveness within PBIS. It's much bigger than that, but that's a little example. So the third one was academic instruction. I've got a definition of engaging academic instruction for you. It might be different from what you're used to, but it comes with these 4 components that are research validated. Use explicit instruction, so we identify what we want students to do and actually teach them that. Build their background knowledge so that they can take what they are learning and relate it to what they've already learned before. Increasing opportunities to respond so that it's engaging, and provide performance feedback. Like I said, your definition might be different, and that's okay. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, here are results from a school district in Oregon that's outside of Portland that uses that same definition and has really decreased the opportunity gap, or the difference in achievement between white and Latina students. So you can see shrinking quite a bit over time, not because of change in zip codes, not because of change in making the neighborhood more affluent or something like that, but having really strong focus on those 4 components of instruction. Fourth piece I'm not going to touch on, that is equity policies, or discipline policies for equity, and we've got a guide there. It's online on that page, so you can find it right there, and Mike has put the link right in the chat box so you can get there. And then the last one, implicit bias. I'll spend just a touch more time on this one because I think it's a useful thing for us to think through, and we can actually use our data to identify some places where our implicit biases might color the decisions that we make. So there's a sort of old school view that says, hey, we all have racial biases, and those biases are directly related to discipline disproportionality. And there's 2 big problems with that. Number one is when you only identify one cause of a problem that you're trying to change, you got to put all of your eggs in one basket. The second problem with that is that about 60 years of social psychology research has shown that when we try to intervene to change people's racial biases, their personal biases, we are as likely to strengthen them as we are to weaken them. That's really scary. But there's another view of bias that says, yes, even though that's true, some of this depends on the situation. There are situations where we may make perfectly equitable decisions regardless of our biases, and there's some where we are more likely to make wrong choices, or choices that where we're treating students differently based on the way they look. And we can actually use our data to identify what those situations are. Here's an example of some that we've found from a national look at data. Subjective behaviors, so defiance, disrespect, and disruption, the 3 Ds. Those ones, we see more disproportionality in those 3 categories than all other categories. Also, when our discipline system is vague, remember I was talking about ambiguity before, when I don't know a student particularly well. Maybe for me, if I'm hungry or tired, and then also in classrooms too. So I'm going to talk you through how to assess disproportionality, and also, really quickly, also how to find out these particular situations, or vulnerable decision points, we call them. So I'm going to walk you through this guide for the rest of the time that we've got here. You don't need to have it in front of you. I'm going to walk you through all the parts of it, but it'll be useful to pick up and use, and we're actually going to be revising it a little bit this fall. And so what you're seeing is some stuff, some revisions that we've made to make it a little bit more precise, a little bit more specific. So to do this work, there's some things that you're going to need from your discipline data systems. You're going to need good entry of office referral data. You're going to need good entry of student race or ethnicity, not just us guessing at their background based on what they look like, but by being really careful with our enrollment forms. You're going to need to have total school enrollment by race or ethnicity to get some of the metrics that I'm going to show you how to calculate. You're going to need to have school teams be able to access this, not just district teams. I've worked with a number of districts where the district teams, district administrators, have lots of great information about disproportionality in their schools, but the schools don't have access to it. And then also the capability to disaggregate office referrals, suspensions as well, and those patterns by race or ethnicity, so we can look separately by group or subgroup to look at those patterns as I was describing. Now there are also some recommended features that we have. So the more standardized your office referral forms, the better. If it is one of those old school incident reports where everything is an open field and there's lots of lines and white space on it, you're going to have a really hard time actually using those data for decision making, and it's actually going to take a long time for you to enter and try to figure it out. That's a lot of time that's wasted in data collection as opposed to using one that is standardized with checkboxes, with clear definitions of problem behavior, and also clear guidance and discipline procedures, meaning what are the things that classify what's the difference between a minor or warning slip, that where you stay in the classroom or in the immediate area if you're not in the classroom, versus what are the ones that are a stage 2 or 3 referral where you get sent to the office, depending on your district or state definitions there. Very, very helpful to have instantaneous graphing capabilities so you can look at that right away. Capability to show those graphs by race or ethnicity, and then automatic calculation of some of this disproportionality data. Particularly if you're afraid of math, you want a system that will actually calculate all those things for you. Now there are a lot of data systems that might be able to do this for you. The one that I'm going to describe for you here is called SWIS, the School-Wide Information System. That's the one that we've built here, and we know that it meets these criteria because we've actually built it specifically to address equity in school discipline. And we've been building features for the last 10 years to really be able to look at this and help the most. And there may very well be, your school discipline system may very well have all of that, and that's great. I think it's useful for you to look at that. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about SWIS, you can go to this website. I am going to show you some examples that come right from SWIS because we've got it here. If you ever wanted to look at the a demo account and see, you just click right here, you go on to pbisapps.org, go to app demos, and then on this page you just go right here to SWIS check-in, check-out SWIS, and individual student SWIS demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a 4-step problem-solving model. Some of you might be familiar with it for making discipline decisions. You might be familiar with something very similar to it if you're using the TIPS process, the team-initiated problem-solving. If you've got teams that are using TIPS, you can take all of this information that I'm going to share with you and put it right into the TIPS process. This 4-step one is a little bit more simple, and it's a little bit more geared towards specific steps for equity decision making. But if you're already using TIPS, by all means, keep using that. So this 4-step approach has problem identification as step number 1. The main question that we're asking there is there a problem? And if there's a problem, how big of a problem is it? Number 2, why is it happening? Okay, what are the root causes behind the problem? What are the things that we're seeing that we might be able to make a change? Number 3 is what should be done, plan implementation. And then plan evaluation. Is that plan that we put together and implemented in step 3 actually working? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through all 4 of these steps. I'm going to do it with some examples. There's actually a case study that comes from the data guide that I'll be able to describe for you. So you get a little bit of a sense of this. One of the things that I caution you on is that it's really easy, because it's so uncomfortable, because this is a little bit of an extra challenge, or it's a little harder than just looking at school-wide data. It's very useful to have a strong step-by-step process. So the data guide gives you that. There's also a Word document, the PBIS Discipline Disproportionality Worksheets, which walks you through step-by-step how to do this. And you've got it in Word to make whatever changes you need to as well. So step number 1, problem identification. Is there a problem? 3 main activities to identify if there's a problem. Number 1 is you got to pick what are the outcomes that you're most interested in. So there's office referrals and suspensions, obviously from the discipline side. You may also want to be looking at achievement, graduation, special education eligibility. You might look at advanced placement or gifted eligibility. You may look at school climate data, say from the California Healthy Kids surveys, anything like that. Whatever you're most interested in, collect that and use that. Then, task number 2 is to pick metrics, which is I'm just talking about statistics here, that quantify the difference in outcomes by race or ethnicity. And one of the things, like I was saying before, that this is a little bit more difficult to do is that if you measure it just one way, you might actually get really different results if you measure it a different way. So just using one way to count disproportionality is really not enough. Once you've calculated those, then compare to some goals to see how well you're doing and answer that question of, is there a problem? So one of the things that we've come up with, and this is not necessarily in the data guide, but it'll be in the next edition of it, is to think about picking at least one what we call absolute metric and one relative metric. And I'm going to talk you through these, but I want to just give you a little bit of a sense of what this is. So an absolute metric are the raw numbers that are different for each group. And that might be just the raw numbers. It might be the discrepancy between the group and a goal that you have. But it just tells us how much for discipline. It tells us how much each group is exposed to exclusionary discipline. Another one that you might know is from achievement is the percent of students meeting or exceeding expectations on your state academic assessment. That's an absolute metric. It says what percent of students from each of these different groups. That's a little different from a relative metric, which is taking those absolute metrics and comparing them to each other. And that's often done in a ratio. Sometimes people will do it in a difference as well. And I'll describe those as well. But what this does is it actually quantifies not just student performance, but how big of a difference is in performance or challenges or exposure or exclusionary discipline between groups. I'm going to try to share with you just a little story. So I've got a couple of schools. This is all made up, so these aren't real schools. But the importance of having multiple metrics. So here's this one school. This is East Middle School. They've got high overall rates of exclusionary discipline. So lots of referrals for all sorts of students. Students are getting sent to the office a lot. Students are in-school suspension or detention a lot. Students are getting suspended a lot. Very high absolute rates for black students or African American students. High absolute rates for white students. But moderate relative differences in exclusionary discipline because everybody's getting excluded a lot. And so in the grand scheme of things, this school might not be flagged as disproportionate because there's not a very big difference between the referral rates for black students and white students, even though they might look kind of big and everybody's worried. So compare that. Here's another school in the same district where they've been implementing really good Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 systems, and they've got really low overall rates of exclusionary discipline. Low absolute rates for black students and very low absolute rates for white students. What you find when you start doing these metrics and doing these, looking at the relative ones, is that there might be huge differences in exclusionary discipline because those numbers are really, really small. So a little bit more looks like a lot more when you've got small numbers. So this school ends up getting flagged as disproportionate. And what you can see is probably as you're thinking about this, you're really going to approach East Middle School very differently from West Middle School. They both have challenges in terms of equity, but their challenges are really different. You know, on the East side, we've got tons of students getting referred all the time. On the West side, not a whole lot. The systems are working very well for some student groups and not necessarily very well or pretty well maybe for others. So the way that we would approach that is really different, and that's why we want to use both absolute, those are the ones on the top, and relative ones. So the recommendations we have for the absolute is rates per subgroup, and I'll show you how to calculate those. And then for the relative, what are called risk ratios that you might be familiar with. And you see we recommend calculating that for both office referrals and OSS's out-of-school suspensions. So I'm going to show you these calculations. I'm going to go through them sort of quickly because all the math is right here and you'll be able to capture it from the worksheets that we got. But to calculate rates per subgroup, here are the things that you need. You need total office referrals that are disaggregated by each group. That's just the total count of referrals. And you would do the same thing for suspensions as well. And then you need the enrollment of the group. Divide those, multiply by 100, and you get this rate of office referrals for subgroup per 100 students. Optionally, if you've got it, the number of school days, which is particularly useful if you're going to compare, you know, do it by month or do it by quarter or trimester or semester or however you want to do that, then that's going to be really useful because that's actually going to change, especially if you're trying to compare that to uneven distances. So here's some data for a school, and if you look, first we'll look at white students. Here's 555 discipline events or office referrals, enrollment of 993. So if you've done your math in your head, 555 divided by 993 times 100, you get 55.89 office referrals per 100 students. For Latina students, 165 over 267, and you end up with 61.79 office referrals per 100 students. All right. So, if you're doing this and you're using SWIS, then you just grab these and you can see, you'll be able to get them from the SWIS ethnicity report, referrals by ethnicity, and then look at the data table. That'll give you a number of referrals. And then you can do the same thing for a number of enrolled students. And then to go back and get the days, you just go to the core report. So I'll show you what this looks like. It's pretty straightforward. So you've gone to the ethnicity report right here. You've scrolled down to referrals by ethnicity. You've clicked from the graph to the data table. Let's look at Native American students. 9 referrals, 6 students. 9 divided by 6 times 100, that's 150 office referrals per 100 students. Then you go to the average referrals. So you go into the core report, average referrals, and then for the entire school year, 177 days. 9 by 6 times 100 divided by 177, and you get 0.85 office referrals per 100 students per day. And so the reason for doing that is that you can then compare it across different times of year. You can compare this to schools in other districts that have different numbers of days. And then you can compare this across, as you can see, to national data. And I included this PDF, the SWIS report, from in the handouts. So Mike put those up on the website here. And then what you can do is you can take this median office referrals per day, you can stick that up on the screen, and I'll show you, here's some data from a real school. So this is what it looks like here. You've got 3 different years, and you've got rates per 100 students per day, all calculated with each one of these. And you've got the green line is white students, the blue line is black students, and then that dotted peach line is the national median. And so what you can see is that bigger differences have decreased, and now both referrals for both black and white students are below the national median. There is still a difference, you can see that in 2014-15, but much smaller and less at risk there. So I've got a question from Luke here. Wondering if SWIS will add a way to know the office referrals per day per different groups within drill down. Will this be automated? This particular metric right here is not automated yet because we're toying around with making absolute sure that it's the one that we're 100% confident that people should be using. So we're moving a little bit slowly with that. You can be an early adopter by using this, but you can look at ODRs per day for different groups using the drill down reports as well. It's just not automated right now. So when you do the drill down, if you look, if you're used to going into drill down, and I'll show you some pictures from that, you can just look in the table below and you can get counts of referrals by subgroup as well. So you can grab them from there. Those you'll just need to want to make sure you fix the year for it. So let's go to ones that are actually automated within SWIS that are used a little bit more often. The next one here that people use is the risk index. We actually recommend that this is really just a building block for the next one. The risk index, as I was describing in that very first chart that I showed, is simply the percent of group that receives an office referral or suspension, or the risk for that outcome. And you just calculate that by, it looks very similar to what I was describing before, but instead of rates, it's students. So what you do here is number of students with 1 or more referrals divided by number of students in the group. That's always going to be a smaller number on the top. And that gives you a risk index. So here in this picture here is Latina students, 101 referrals, 123 students, and you get a risk index there. And you can see here, I've given you the math, but if you're using SWIS, the risk index pops out right for you. So here's an example. This comes right from the SWIS ethnicity report. You can set the dates for this and calculate that. And what you can see here is the risk index for each of these student groups, and then the number right above the label is the number of students in that group. Things do look a little bit different if you say have 1 or 2 students you want to treat that a little bit differently than if you have 65 or 100 or 300 students there. So like I said, this one's calculated automatically. I want to show you too some risk index data from your state, so from California. These are schools using SWIS in California and sharing data with the National Center. So what you see here is, here's the risk index right here. What this would say is, if you're black, you have about just over a 1 in 5 chance of receiving at least one referral in elementary school. So what you might do, as you're starting to think about your comparisons, is draw a line for white students and then look at who's above and below to sort of get a little bit of a general sense. But you can also see how these go up and down, particularly up in middle schools as more students are getting referrals. So here are the scores in middle school. Patterns look somewhat similar, but everybody's getting a few more referrals. And then patterns look actually a little bit different in high schools, and you can see that there. And here's the line that you have. So the core thing is that risk index is an absolute, but when you change it to a relative, the way to do that is to use something called a risk ratio. And you just take that risk index for the group you're concerned about and divide it by the risk index of a comparison group. And that comparison group is often the federal government's recommending to use all other students. Sometimes people use all other students, sometimes people use white students as the comparison group. All other students is sometimes more stable when you've got, especially when you've got lots of different groups, not just majority white students like you have in California. But the math is a little bit easier for white students, so you can do it either way. The math is not too terribly hard, but it takes a little bit more work to do. So you just have your risk index of your target group divided by the risk index of the comparison group. And as you see, the example that we had before, 82% was our risk index for Latina students, 65% for white students. That number gets to be 1.27. And so what that means is that students who are Latina in our demo school are 1.27 times more likely to get referrals than white students. 1 is equal, over 1 is overrepresentation, and under 1 is underrepresentation. So here is a risk ratio report. This came out, if you haven't been looking, this came out last Thursday in SWIS, and we're pretty excited about having that out there here. And what you can see, if you look up at the top, you see this is for major referrals, and the comparison group is all other students. So it compares that group to every, for example, for Native American students, it compares Native American students to all students who are not Native American in school, and what you can see is a slight increase compared to that. I figure I'll show you as well. You'd probably be interested in seeing what these look like for those data I showed you before in California. Here's that risk ratio. Remember, 1 is even, above is overrepresentation, and below is underrepresentation. And we'll talk about goals to set for there as well. Here it is for middle school, and here it is for high school. If you are a district or a state person and you have an account with PBIS evaluation, that Excel worksheet that I showed you, or you just work with multiple districts and want to enter some of that info, you can get district or state pictures just like I built for you there. That's for other schools. If you're using SWIS, then you already automatically get risk index and risk ratio built in there. And you can change the comparison group to all other students, white students, etc. Other places to get these data, the federal government has built a really nice website called Rethink Discipline, and one of the things they have are some maps of out-of-school suspension. So remember that feds don't actually collect office referral data. They collect out-of-school suspension rates. So what you can see here is you can actually, this is a clickable map if you go online, not this picture on your PDF. This is percent of all students who have received one or more out-of-school suspensions. So this is the risk index for out-of-school suspensions. And then what you can see, this is overall, and then this is what it looks like for black students. So big, big difference there. And you can actually go and you can look and you can click right on your district and get the data. They're from the most recent OCR data, so it's still 2011-2012, although 2013-14 ought to be coming out any day now. So then the last part of step one is comparing that to goals that you have. That can be either previous years from your same school, if you've been collecting data and looking and saying, are we making progress? Are we not? Some other things that you can do, you could look at district norms or state norms or national norms. I'll show you here from that 2011-2012 data. These are schools using SWIS with at least 10 black and at least 10 white students. The median black-white ODR risk ratio was 1.84. You may say, gosh, I don't really want to be in the middle. I'd really like to be in the top performing schools in this area, and so that would be 1.38. And then the logical criteria is something else you might use. We have been thinking about using the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I always get that wrong. EEOC. They've got a definition of disparate impact, which means race is not mentioned in any of the policies, but there is a still an effect by race, and that that converts. So sometimes people call this the 4/5 rule. That would mean a risk ratio range between 0.8 on the low side and 1.25 on the high side. So one of the things you get used to when you do these risk ratios is there's this sort of seesaw where if one is up, then one must be down. And so the idea of getting 1.0 all the way across the board is unlikely, and the idea of getting everybody below 1.0 is impossible. That's where you're really trying to think about doing, looking at an absolute number there. And Adriana, the website that we were talking about is actually the ed.gov site, and you can find it on the PDFs. I can enter it in a little bit. So here's an example from a school. This is a school using SWIS. They decided they're going to look at their black-white risk ratio with a goal of all groups with a risk ratio below 1.25. Oh, thank you, Shauna. So you see their steps, calculate the risk indices, calculate the risk ratios. They found Latina slightly elevated, 1.1, less of a concern than the African American risk ratio of 3.2. So they've set a goal, current 3.2, goal is 1.25. So the good news is a lot of the instruction in step one has been the stuff that takes a long time, so it's going to be a little bit quicker to go through steps 2, 3, and 4. Problem analysis. So now that we've identified that there's a problem, that school has identified that there's a big problem, we can go through and identify why is it happening. So here's some steps that we recommend. Number one is look at your Tier 1 systems. Check fidelity of implementation. Check to see if you actually have some kind of systems for improving school climate in schools and improving the predictability of classroom environments and the consistency of school discipline. Assess some disparities other than discipline, achievement, attendance, graduation, school climate, some of those other ones that you were looking at. And then also then start looking at your actual discipline data for some patterns that might indicate explicit or overt or conscious bias versus implicit or unconscious bias. So I'm going to show you just a few pictures of that. This is really going to be just awareness building here. I could spend easily 2 or 3 more webinars just looking at this, but I want to just give you a sense of it and you can see. So explicit would be conscious bias. What you would see if there was if there were high rates of explicit bias in your school, you would see students of color from whatever group you're looking at get consistently over-referred no matter what, all the time. That's different from patterns where you would see implicit bias, where you would see peaks and valleys of disproportionality. So some situations with lots of disproportionality, some situations with less or even equity in different situations. And the situations that I'm talking about, and I described this a little bit before, are called vulnerable decision points. We call them VDPs for short. And that's a disciplined decision that we would make that's more vulnerable to the effects of implicit bias. Some of it is a situation, and some of it is how I'm feeling as somebody making a disciplined decision about a student, my internal state. So some things you could do. You could say, you know what, anytime I'm going to send a student to the office or anytime I'm thinking about sending a student home, that's a vulnerable decision point. That's okay, but the research says that we will do better if we're more specific. So there are ways to identify specific VDPs. Number one is we could look at national data, and I've described some of those national level vulnerable decision points to you. You can also look at your own school or district data. Or you can start thinking about yourself and how you feel, and when are some times when you might get stuck where your first reaction is not necessarily to reteach students. So the way to get into this, and I know Luke was asking this before, is a particular feature in SWIS called drill down. And in drill down, what you do is you can add filters in and out to look at all of the same pictures you would normally, but be able to use different filters. So to say, okay, we're just going to look at the pattern for Latina students. We're just going to look at the pattern for African American students. We're just going to look at the pattern for Asian American students and see where there are differences. And you can also do all other. So if you were to say we're most interested in our Latina students, and then we look at our pattern, we would just move them from that include in data set on the left side, just drag it to the right over here to the exclude from data set, and then you get all others. So here's a little bit of a step. What you would do, if you're used to using tips and the idea of identifying a precise problem statement, what you're going to look for is where are the most referrals coming from. I didn't say what's the most problem behavior because office referrals are an interaction between student behavior and adult behavior. And the referral itself is an adult decision that's made. So you identify what are the most common patterns for white or all students or wherever your comparison group is, and then what are the most common patterns for students in your group of interest, and then find those differences. So here's a little example if you're not used to the idea of precise problem statements. Office referrals are commonly issued for white students for this behavior in this location during this time for students in this grade. So like I said, I'm going to go through this quickly just so you have a sense of what this looks like. The steps are all there. The worksheet describes it. In this school, here's a school where they're most concerned about black-white office discipline referral disparities. So what you do is you go into drill down in SWIS or whatever your discipline system allows for this. Set your filter, in this case look for white students, then generate your behavior, location, time, and grade, and then do the same thing all over again but for black students. So this is looking at the black-white differences. You'll be able to see these in the handouts, the PDF handouts that are there. But what you end up doing is being able to look as a staff or on your team and say, okay, here are behavior referrals for white students. Here are behavior referrals for black students. So you already see a difference that for white students it's other as the main problem. For black students it's defiance. And what we know, subjectivity, makes you think a little bit about that. For white students in the classroom, For black students, also in the classroom. For white students, sort of spread throughout the day, kind of increasing and then drops off right after the lunchtime, it seems. Black students the most right at the beginning of the day and then at a few specific times. Grade level for white students, kind of evenly dispersed. Black students, whoa, grade 8, what's going on there? So we're not going to do this activity right now, but I just want to share this with you and have you think a little bit of two ways of approaching this school. One is, oh my gosh, we have to deal with this problem of race, and are you calling me a racist, and what's going on here, and oh, this is a societal problem, and we can't handle this in our schools because there's something wrong with the families, or you know, that kind of nonsense. Or you can say, hey, wait a minute. Here's the specific problem in our school. We get office referrals most commonly for black students when it's a referral for defiance in classrooms in the first 30 minutes of the day, particularly for students in 8th grade. Now the great thing about that is all of a sudden we've got something really actionable that we can do. So this team in particular, you can think on your own. If you're watching in your own time, then pause it and then think. Here are some things that this team did. Not all of them, but a few. Number one is before all the students came in the building, the principal made a PA announcement saying, hey everybody, remember to expect some unwanted behavior right in the beginning of the day, particularly students in middle school. So be ready and be ready to respond calmly as opposed to with a little bit of fury. Then, what are the things that we're doing in the classroom right at the beginning of the day? So another thing they did is all of the staff greeted students at the door by name, said something positive or neutral to them, and then directed them to an easy startup practice activity so they weren't jumping right into difficult, frustrating academic work right in the beginning. We're easing them into the school day by giving them some success, building a little bit of momentum. The other thing they did is they had food, they had snacks available, so if any student was hungry, any student hadn't had breakfast, they could at least get something in their tummies before they got the day started. So here's the example from this school. We've got TFI says that they're doing pretty well. That's a tiered fidelity inventory, but said, you know what, they need to improve their consequence systems, office and staff manage behavior. Drill down said their referrals were most commonly in the classroom for inappropriate language right before lunch, and then you can see a big gap in reading achievement for black students in particular. So they know that they're going to need to do some academic work as well. Plan implementation. What you do is you take the information you got from step 2, those root causes, and say, what are we going to do to pick some strategies to do things differently? And then you build a plan. Here are some options. I'm not going to read these off to you because you'll have them. We always recommend everybody collect data and share it regularly no matter what. If you're identifying inadequate PBIS implementation or something that you're not doing particularly well, watch out for that. Implement till you get to criterion. Implement all the parts that aren't there yet. You might identify that there are misunderstandings regarding school-wide expectations. Okay, so we gotta talk with the people who we're working with to have a little bit of a sense of this. What we want to watch out for is these misunderstandings of behavior. Right? I did not slap you, I high-fived your face. We want to watch out that when we're unclear with our expectations that we don't see behavior that we don't want just because we haven't been clear with students about it. If there are disparities in academic achievement, go to that brief on engaging academic instruction, disproportionality across all settings, strong equity policies that include accountability. Specific settings, teach neutralizing routines for vulnerable decision points. So identify what are those challenges and then work through, just like I described with that school, for the first 30 minutes of the day. Here's that school here. This is their action plan that you can look at, the parts that they worked on, particularly in terms of plan implementation, who's going to do it, when are they going to do it by. And then the last one, is the plan working? Assess fidelity of plan implementation. We recommend doing that monthly. Calculating our disproportionality metrics. The disproportionality metrics, particularly the relative ones, can bounce a lot. So we recommend looking at those quarterly as opposed to every single month. If you want to look at them monthly because you're interested, I think that's really good. You just have to watch out one little change, particularly if you've got small proportions of some student groups are going to look really, really different. So doing it quarterly is going to give you a little bit more stability and a little bit more accuracy in what those are. And then compare those to the goals. And then the last one, share out your results with everybody. Don't be afraid of sharing your data. So here's this school. They, as you can see, are looking at their data quarterly. They've seen a drop in the risk ratio. It's better. It's not quite at their goal yet, so they want to keep working on it, revise our action plan for next year. So given that, here are some big ideas I want you to leave with, and then I'll stick around and do some chatting as well. Disproportionality in school discipline, one of the biggest challenges in education today. I don't think anyone can argue that one. But we can use our data to assess and monitor how we're doing. But note, you need to have some specific kinds of data to be able to do this work. And so if you don't have those data or don't know how to get those data, make sure to advocate for it. Get the data systems that you need, get the training that you need, make sure that you have access to the numbers that are going to be most helpful for you. And then know that the same steps we have for addressing challenging behavior are the same steps, same general process we can use for enhancing equity in school discipline as well. So I thank you for your time, and I will open it up for questions. So ask away, and I'm happy to answer.